Thanks, Ben. By the way, I just got word that you guys don't use the Brittany mic at this service anymore, but nobody told me, so here I have it on, representing my generation. Do you guys know who Britney Spears is? You know, like, oh, good. Okay, cool. All right, so I'm excited to be here tonight. I have really enjoyed this John series, and how we are discovering the ways in which when Jesus encounters people throughout John's gospel, the ways that their lives are transformed, and where they discover hope in new and incredible ways. And so tonight we're talking about we're covering three different stories. We're at the end of John, chapter 20 and 21. And instead of points, we're just going to do 3 acts around a theme, sort of This American Lifestyle for NPR fans out there. But we're just going to tell these 3 stories. And the encouragement would be to find yourself in these stories a little bit. And one of the ways to do that is to actually remove the narrator perspective that we have. And what I mean by that is we know the fullness of Scripture, right? We know what happens. We know why Jesus dies. We know why he rises. And so we get the whole picture. But the people in these stories, they don't have that whole picture. They have a limited perspective. There it is being exposed to them day to day. And so we'll find that while we are looking at some stories from post-resurrection, so we might expect them to be like celebration and people that get it, we'll actually find that these people have more like post-disappointment stories. This is much more about them expecting Jesus to be one way and finding a sense of being disordered and confused and a bit disappointed because Jesus is different than who they thought he would be. And so none of them have this full picture, although they have all been on this incredible journey with Jesus. So we're talking about Mary, Thomas, and Peter. And so they've been with Jesus as he has performed miracles and changed people's hearts and minds. They've seen water turned into wine. They've seen thousands of people fed with a few loaves of bread and a few fish. And they've given up their lives to follow Jesus, right? The lives that they once lived, the places they once lived in, the families they once lived alongside, they've left that to follow Jesus and be on a journey with him. And then he dies. Like, from their perspective, Jesus pointed to what he was doing, but they didn't totally get it. And so they've given up everything, and Jesus dies. And so then they have to figure out, well, now what? Like, what just happened? Who am I now? What did I give my life for? And they have to ponder these questions. It's very disorienting for them. And so we'll pick the stories up kind of right after the resurrection and begin to see the ways in which Jesus meets them in that place. And so we're going to start with Mary. That's Act 1. It's a portrait of grief. And this is Mary Magdalene. So just a reminder of her story that Jesus heals her of 7 demons. And so her primary experience of Jesus is through mercy. She experiences his transformative power that actually literally changes her life. And so she too gives up everything to join Jesus in his journey and support his mission on the road. And so we'll pick her story up. She's at the tomb after Jesus has died in John 20, verse 11. Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she cried, she bent down to look into the tomb. She saw 2 angels dressed in white, seated where the body of Jesus had been, one at the head and one at the foot. The angel asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" She replied, "They have taken away my Lord, and I don't know where they've put him." As soon as she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she didn't know it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who are you looking for?" Thinking he was a gardener, she replied, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Don't hold on to me, for I haven't gone up to my Father. Go to my brothers and sisters and tell them, I'm going up to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene left and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." Then she told them what she had seen. And so we find Mary at the place of Jesus' tomb, and she's weeping. Like, this is a sustained weeping. This is overwhelming grief. And she says, "They have taken away my Lord, and I don't know where they've put him." She can't find his body. And just, she's experienced Jesus through mercy. He's changed her life. She loves him deeply. She has gone on a journey with him. And so she's weeping at his tomb because, in a sense, her hope is gone. Like, this person she put her hope in, he's no longer there. And there's this further indignity of his body isn't there either. And so she's looking for it. And she sees Jesus. When Jesus comes to her, she sees him, but she doesn't know it's him. She thinks it's the gardener, which has got to be really awkward at some point once she figures it out. She's like, oh, sorry, I thought you were the gardener. I thought you were mowing the lawn. Jesus is the Son of God, and she didn't quite see it. But she doesn't recognize him, right? And until Jesus calls her by name, it is only then that she sees him for who he is. In a way, her sorrow is like a fog, blinding her from her ability to see that Jesus is in front of her, in fact, alive and resurrected. And so we ask the question, like, why is she confused? How could she not see him? How could she not be aware that it was Jesus in front of her? And I think part of the answer is that she was looking for the wrong thing. She was looking for the location of a dead body, essentially. She was saying, where is it? And she's so shocked to find Jesus alive, and not just Jesus alive, but Jesus resurrected, which is so much more. And so she asks the question, where is he? And the only category she has, like all of us, the category she has for an answer to where is he is like a location of his body, best case scenario, a location of just a risen body. But instead, the answer that Jesus gives her is actually the whole of the gospel. He says, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. So she's looking for like a place, for Jesus to be in a place. And it's actually so much more than that. It's Jesus becoming alive through resurrection that will transcend space and time, where Jesus will then from that place ascend to the Father and connect to all of us and have an indwelling relationship with them. It's the good news of the kingdom coming and still coming. It's the good news of creation that we hope for and wait for. And so it's so much more than what she's looking for that she can't quite see it. She's looking for the material presence of Jesus' body, and she's given instead something greater. She's given hope. She's given an indwelling relationship with Jesus. And I wonder sometimes if we have this experience in our own hopelessness, when we are kneeling at the graves of the things we have lost. We are kneeling at the graves of hope that has been lost, of dreams that we had that are now gone. And we say, they have taken away my fill in the blank, my marriage, my ability to have children, my career, my relationships, my joy. What is the thing that we feel like when it's gone, there's a sense of hopelessness, and we find ourselves kneeling at the grave and weeping and grieving over it? And what Jesus does is he actually allows her to grieve, but he doesn't just make the dead thing alive again, because what she wants is just this dead body, best case scenario, dead body alive. He actually offers so much more. He offers a resurrected, risen Jesus as the Messiah, who actually gives hope to all people across all time. And so I lived this recently. I had to wrestle with this very personally recently. My dad passed away on September 8th, so just a couple of months ago. And he was really sick for a couple months. It went pretty quickly. But I have one sister in Tennessee, and she flew out when it was getting really bad, and the four of us went to visit him. I have three sisters. So the four of us went to visit him. They only let two people in the hospital room at a time. And so for whatever reason that day, the security guard kind of turned the other way and allowed the four of us to be in there. So we get to tell stories and be with him and grieve, and it was an important day. It really mattered. But my sister on the way home was like, I just think it's so incredible that God would just perform this sort of miracle for us so that we could be together with our dad and grieving. Isn't it beautiful that God would intervene in that way? And so I'm driving home from this interaction, and I'm thinking, I'm wrestling with God and I'm praying because I'm thinking, that's what you're doing, God? We are begging you to intervene and heal my dad, and you're intervening, but you're doing it to, mess with the security guard's awareness so we can be together and grieve. That's not what we asked for. That's not what we wanted. We don't want to grieve. We want you to do the actual thing. If you're going to intervene, do the thing, So I'm just wrestling with God about this. And it was one of the few moments in my life where I feel like God really interrupted me. And he was like, hey, Brooke, when have I been about just keeping people alive? Because if it's true that we are an Easter people, and by that I mean if it's true that death is just the doorway to greater life, then God is in no way afraid of death. He's not just trying to keep us alive because he knows and understands the hope that we are headed for, the new creation that we are going towards. And so he isn't just trying to keep people alive. He's saying, I'm actually joining you so that you can grieve well, because we will move towards death. That is inevitable. But so isn't it God's grace all the same to join me in my grief and help us move well in our grief in our life, so that we move well towards death, so that we live well, and yes, we die well, but then we rise well. And that is what Jesus offers, which is so much bigger than what I was looking for. I was saying, make my dad okay, make him alive. That is what I wanted. And Jesus reminded me, I gave you so much more than that. And it's a greater hope and it's a greater glory. And so his news of Jesus ascending to the Father, it's not the answer Mary's looking for. It's not the answer I'm looking for sometimes. But it's the best possible news to anyone who believes it. Because it means while we can grieve those dead bodies and those dead dreams and that dead hope and those things that we have lost, we can kneel at the grave and grieve over that. We can also know that we have certain hope in Jesus, certain hope for life eternal, and what we're headed for. And then he tells Mary, which I think is such a beautiful thing, she has this encounter with Jesus. She sees clearly what's happened, that he is the Messiah, he is resurrected, and he says, go and tell. This is a new beginning, this is a new creation. Tell the story of what you've seen. All right, so that's Act 1. How are we doing? We okay? A little heavy. Okay. Okay, so the next one is Thomas. Thomas is a portrait of doubt. By the way, I just love that the Bible is full of a bunch of people who just don't do it great. It's just kind of people who sort of fall short all the time. And if you read the Bible, you're like, oh, it's not a bunch of stories of people that we can't live up to. I'm like, I can live up to doubt. I think, okay, there's something I can do. I can go for that. I always find that's a beautiful thing, because it's never about us and how good we do. It's always about God and how good he is, right? So Thomas is a portrait of doubt. And reminder that Thomas is with Jesus the whole time. So he's with Jesus he's with Jesus through all the miracles, through all that happens. He sees it all in front of him. So if someone should believe, it's Thomas, right? And yet, he gave up his life to follow Jesus. He's with him. He's close to Jesus. And yet Jesus dies. So he has that same experience of now what? Jesus wasn't who he thought he would be. And so let's pick up his story in John 20, verse 24. Thomas, the one called Didymus, one of the 12, wasn't with the disciples when Jesus came. The other disciples told him, we've seen the Lord. But he replied, unless I see the nail marks in his hands, put my finger in the wounds left by the nails, and put my hand into his side, I won't believe. After 8 days, his disciples were again in a house, and Thomas was with them. Even though the doors were locked, Jesus entered and stood among them. He said, peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, put your fingers here. Look at my hands. Put your hand into my side. No more disbelief. Believe. Thomas responded to Jesus, my Lord and my God. Jesus replied, do you believe because you see me? Happy are those who don't see and yet believe. And so the disciples, many of them were with Jesus that first Easter day. And so they got to see Jesus alive and in person. But Thomas wasn't there. And so they tell Thomas, they come to him and they're so excited and they're celebrating and it's all exclamation marks. And they're like, Jesus is alive. And Thomas is like, no, he's just unwilling to be taken by their testimony. He's just not going to be a fool again. He's not going to fall for that again. Remember that he's put his life and his hopes in Jesus and he dies and he's feeling a sense of being disoriented. Now what? And so there's that feeling of when you put your hope in something and it falls short and you're like, I'm just not going to do it again because that feels really vulnerable and I don't want to fall again because that was worse than the hoping. And so I think that's what Thomas is experiencing. I just can't do that again. And so then Jesus comes into a locked house and he meets Thomas there. And Jesus doesn't rebuke him for his doubt. He's actually really compassionate. He shows him his hands and allows Thomas to see that he is in fact alive. And Thomas's response, I think, is the only appropriate response when we see Jesus for who he is, when we get it. He says, my Lord and my God. It is the most simple and complete prayer. If you find yourself ever without words in prayer, that is the prayer. It's everything, my Lord and my God. And so Thomas, what he's discovered in Jesus' hands is not just Jesus being alive, but it's more than that. It's more than what he can see or touch. He has the full understanding now of what the resurrection meant. It meant that Jesus is Messiah. It meant the kingdom has come and is coming. It meant that we are moving towards new creation. And so Thomas gets it, and he has that response, my Lord and my God. And then Jesus goes on to say, blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe. So this is a moment where he's both accepting Thomas's worshipful response, but he's also saying that for all the generations to come, we don't get to see Jesus' hands. We believe off the testimony of the believers. We believe off the testimony of the gospel. We believe off of our own encounters with God. And so he's really, more than anything, he's encouraging the believers to come across all future generations, that we are blessed when we believe, even though we don't get to see the scars. Now, the thing is, doubt is a little bit inevitable. Like, in a way, we're all sort of groping around towards the light. We don't have the full picture, just as the disciples did not have the full picture. And so there are a lot of causes for doubt. One of the reasons is probably similar to Thomas, where we are taking our hopes and longings and we're putting them on God. We're projecting them onto God. And then we become very disappointed when he's not who we thought he was. Like, maybe we thought being with Jesus meant that we would get our prayers answered. Maybe we thought that believing in God meant that we would feel deeply his love all the time, and we don't. Sometimes we feel his absence or the feeling of his absence. Or maybe it's that feeling of like, I thought that being with God meant joy, and I actually still feel depression. So there are these things that we hope for to receive from God, that when we don't, we suddenly go, I don't know how to believe anymore. Because I thought you were this, and maybe you're not, and I don't know who you are. And there's a sense of we have to sometimes ask those questions. John Ortberg says, scratch the surface of any cynic, and you'll find it a wounded idealist underneath. So we project these idealistic ideas of who God is and how he will respond and what he will do. And when that doesn't happen, it's deep woundedness. And so the ability to believe again, to hope again, to vulnerably risk hoping becomes like not worth it. And so we become cynical instead. And that's the Band-Aid over what feels like a really deep wound, is cynicism. Because the story doesn't end how we wanted it to, right? Also, secularism does not make it easy to believe, because modern empiricism says it's only true if you can prove it. Postmodernity says it's only true if it feels true to you. So those two things are what we're hearing all the time, and yet Jesus comes to us through revelation, through the testimony of believers, and through the scriptures, and most of it is through mystery. Like, we can't quite see clearly the fullness of it. There's a theologian called G.K. Chesterton, and he talks about truth in a really interesting way. He compares it to the sun and the moon. And he says the truth in its fullness, God's truth, all of it is like the sun. It's massive. We can't even look directly at it. We can't get close to it because it will burn us, right? We can't see the outline of it clearly. We can't even look at it. And so it's very overwhelming. We can't wrap our minds around it. We can't land on it. We don't even know all that much about it because it's just so massive and so full of glory and light that we can't even get that close to it. And so that's the fullness of truth. And sometimes what we do is we actually trade that because we can't manage it or see it or get close to it. So we trade that for the light of the moon, which would be like provable theory. And so we're like, you know what? The moon is really nice. We can land on the moon. We know a lot about it. We can look at it. When we look at it, we can see its outline super clearly. We can wrap our minds around the moon. And so we go, I'm gonna use the light of the moon instead of the light of the sun because I can't understand it. I can't manage it. But the thing about the light of the moon, it is just derivative light from the source. It is just a reflection of the sun. Its light is minuscule in compared to the sun. It does not warm creation. It does not sustain creation. It is so much less. It is just a small reflection of the full truth. But the sun, as glaring as it is, and as beautiful and as massive as it is, we cannot understand it, but it is the light that sustains creation and that warms us. It is the light by which we see everything else. And so for me, I'm a doubting Thomas. I'm just going to say that. I'm relate to him, and he is, people kind of give him a hard time, but like I relate to much of his experience. I actually had 7 years of a deconstruction, sort of undoing of my faith experience, and then ultimately kind of a deconversion season where I didn't think I really believed. And so in that place, I really wanted the Christian truth. I wanted that to be real, very much so. I did not want to live in a hopeless reality. That was very awful to me. So I really wanted God to be who he says he is. And so I decided, okay, I don't know how to believe. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to think my way into belief. There's got to be more information out there that I don't know. And so I'm going to find it. And once I get enough information, then I can believe. That was my whole premise. And so I spent years doing this, studying with a bunch of different people with different perspectives, grasping for truth because I needed some sort of certainty, and I was desperate for it. And I'll just tell you, I never found it, right? Surprise. There just wasn't enough. There wasn't enough information to prove that I could see it and clearly have a sense of certainty. It wasn't there, even though I looked long and hard. And then I met suffering in my life, which I think is our best and cruelest educator. And it was the thing that pried my hands open. And while I was grasping for certainty and I was wanting to hold on, I need to know the truth, I wanted control, suffering taught me that, in fact, I never had control. And I then was able to release my hands and release certainty for the gift of faith, which faith to me has been every bit of faith I possess is a gift from God to me. It does not come easy to me. I still have days where I'm like, are we missing it? But I choose its truth, and I choose to live by its truth every day, even when it doesn't completely feel true, because I trust and I remember the way I've experienced God's faithfulness, and I trust the stories of the believers both in this room and across Christian history, and I trust the testimony of the gospel. And so while I can't wrap my mind around the sun, right, the light of truth, while I can't completely know it and understand it, when I look around, I realize its light is everywhere, right? It is the light by which we see and know everything else. And that's what faith is. It's that understanding and acceptance of while we may not have certainty, we trust and believe that God has revealed himself in so many different places. His light is all over the place. And may I just say, if you're a doubting Thomas like me, you are welcome in this place. Join us in the journey. Continue wrestling. Continue pursuing truth wherever it leads, and I mean that, because I actually think if you pursue truth, you'll find yourself here, because I think this is true. And so follow truth. Keep wrestling with God. Keep searching. Stay in this community. We want you part of this community. Okay? Amen. All right. All right. Act 3, we've got Peter, a portrait of failure, another one we can live up to, a portrait we can fail. So Peter, he is very close to Jesus. He's an advocate for Jesus, and he is with Jesus closely on the journey. Peter is the one who denies Jesus 3 times. So he's very passionately an advocate, so much so that when they come to arrest Jesus, he hacks the ear off of one of the soldiers. So passionately defender of Jesus. And then Jesus dies, and Peter finds himself denying Jesus. And I imagine he's a bit surprised by that himself. But then Jesus dies, and Mary comes to the disciples. She says what she has seen, that Jesus is alive. And Peter is one of the disciples who goes and sees that, in fact, his tomb is empty, the clothes are folded. And yet still he goes back to fishing. So he's there fishing, and Jesus comes to where he is with some of the disciples fishing, and he comes to the shore, and they aren't catching any fish, so he has them put the net on the other side, and they catch a bunch of fish, which is sort of calling back to their original calling. And so they catch a bunch of fish, and John says, "It is the Lord." And so Peter, just right where he is, he can't wait for the boat to dock. He jumps in the water and swims to the shore. And so they're having breakfast around a fire. We'll pick it up there in John 21, verse 15. When they finished eating, Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Simon replied, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." Jesus asked a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Simon replied, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." Jesus said to him, "Take care of my sheep." He asked the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was sad that Jesus asked him a third time. "Do you love me?" he replied. "Lord, you know everything. You know I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. I assure you that when you were younger, you tied your own belt and walked around wherever you wanted. When you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will tie your belt and lead you where you don't want to go." He said this to show the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. After saying this, Jesus said to Peter, "Follow me." And so Peter is kind of like a leader amongst the disciples. He's walked on water. He's one of the ones that confessed Jesus is a Messiah. He has seen the miracles. And yet Peter fails, like in a really massive way. Peter fails. He denies Christ. And I wonder, too, if for Peter, much of his experience with Jesus had to do with Jesus being in a place of influence. For most of their journey, they were sort of on a winning team, right? Like miracles were happening, crowds were coming to them. And so Peter had aligned himself with somebody who had a lot of influence and was sort of winning culturally. People loved him and they were following him. And so then he's put in this position when Peter gets arrested and crucified. Now, can he align himself with someone who's despised? Peter's surprised to find that Jesus is in fact a suffering Savior. When he expected something else, or most of his experience led him to believe that Jesus would be something else, he thought, I don't know, I think that we're just going to keep winning and have these miracles. And I doubt in anyone's minds that they thought that Jesus dying was the answer or the right end to the story. And so he isn't able to align himself with Jesus. And so he rejects him 3 different times. He denies him. And so why? I think probably because he thought Jesus would turn out to be different. He even sees that Jesus is no longer in the tomb, right? He went to see that the clothes were folded, that Jesus wasn't there, and yet he still goes back to fishing. He retreats in his shame. It's that feeling of I just can't live up to it. I've fallen short. And the voice of shame, the story it tells us, is that it is that bad. You shouldn't tell anybody. You should hide. You should retreat from God. You should retreat from prayer. You should retreat from the community because it's that bad and your shame owns you and you cannot come back from it. Brené Brown says shame is that warm feeling that washes over us, making us feel small, flawed, and never good enough. And that's the thing about shame. It is overwhelming, and it tells us stories about who we are that make us feel like we can no longer engage with God, that we cannot be with Jesus. And so what does Jesus do? He comes after him. He comes and meets him where he is fishing, to the place where Peter has retreated to. What must that feel like when we're living, if you can picture a moment in your life where you're living under the weight and the shadow of shame, and Jesus is coming, and he offers an invitation back into love. He reminds us that we have been forgiven. For Peter, his response is just jumping in the water. That's an appropriate response. Just get in the water and start swimming towards him. Because it's such an incredible relief to know that our shame, we don't have to carry it around. Sometimes we like to take our sin back off the cross, and we like to hold on to it. And Jesus said on the cross, "It is finished." And so it is. We get to live in that truth. And sometimes shame tells us, no, you can't. You have to hold on to it. You have to live under the shadow and the weight of the shame because you cannot come back from this. But the thing about Jesus is that it was never about how good Peter was or about how faithful he was. It was always about how good Jesus is and how faithful he is. Because if we based our relationship with Jesus off of our faithfulness and our goodness, we've just read 3 stories and we know it in our own lives, we will always fall short. But Jesus comes to him and instead, he meets him with love and greater compassion and actually invites him back into the dignity of work. He doesn't even bench Peter. He's like, you're still on my team. You're still part of this. Get back in the game. Even though the stakes are high, Peter responds and he steps into that. Jesus says, "Feed my sheep. Love as I love." And he invites Peter back into the dignity of the work of the kingdom. And so what a beautiful thing to see what Jesus' encounter with each of these three individuals is. So we see that we look at these three stories, and what they experience is much of what we experience through the Christian journey, right? Many of us have experienced, like, my grief is too much, I cannot bear it. Many of us have experienced that feeling of I just don't know how to believe. Maybe we've experienced being disappointed in God, thinking that he would be one way and finding out that what we thought he would do for us, he didn't do for us. Or maybe there's that feeling of shame. I just can't live up to it, and I don't know how to crawl out of this hole. And yet for all of them, Jesus is really different from what they were looking for. They thought the Messiah would be a certain way, and he reforms the idea of Messiah around himself. And so while they are disoriented for a time, they name out their disorientation, they talk about their disappointment, they talk about their grief, and yet Jesus comes and meets them in that place. And the encounter, it doesn't actually give them what they expect. The thing that they're looking for, their encounter with Jesus doesn't mean that he just answers them and gives them what they're looking for. He actually gives them something so much more. He lifts their eyes to hope. He offers something so much greater. He offers his love now, his grace now, and the hope of life eternal that we are headed towards. And the other thing that's really powerful about these encounters is Jesus comes to them. None of them have to go find him. In their shame, in their doubt, in their unbelief, Jesus goes to them with his compassion and his love, and he encounters them where they are. And so sometimes our grief and our shame is like, I am so deep in this hole, I don't know how to dig out. I don't know how to come back from this. And Jesus is like, I never asked you to dig out. Like, I'm coming there with you, and I'm meeting you in that rock bottom place that we might find ourselves in, and I'm meeting you there with love. And that very love is what transforms everything. And when he meets these three, he meets Mary in where she is, and he calls her by her name. For Thomas, he offers his hands. For Peter, he goes and finds him fishing and gives him forgiveness and love, and all of them a greater invitation into the kingdom. And so even in their unbelief, even in their shame, even in their sorrow, Jesus' response is actually the whole of the gospel. He is the answer. It's not necessarily what they were looking for, but he is the complete answer. He's the answer to grief, to doubt, to shame, and grace is always, always, always his response. And so our task is to believe like Thomas, to tell like Mary, and to love like Peter. We too are invited into the game, into the work of the kingdom. We are not benched because of anything we've endured or anything we've done. Jesus invites us into greater love and to greater invitation for the work of the kingdom. But what's most powerful, I think, about these stories is that it is that at their very place of their feebleness, like their weakness, their most human parts of themselves, it's in that very small, broken, fragile, feeble place that God's love transforms that and transforms them to be able to see and understand the hope and the glory of God through Jesus' resurrection. And he meets us in that. Each one of us, he meets us in that. And so we want to respond tonight through worship. And I'm just thinking about people in the room who maybe you're experiencing one of these things. Maybe you're experiencing grief or disappointment or doubt. You can't make a sense of God. Or maybe you're experiencing a sense of shame or failure and you don't know how to come back from it. The invitation is to allow God's love to meet you in that place, to allow him to come to that place and have his love transform you. And so if you join me in standing as we respond. We want to have spend some time in prayer and some ministry time so we can invite the prayer team forward. But I just want to invite those groups of people forward. If you find yourself in any one of those places and you're needing Jesus' love to meet you in those feeble, broken places and transform you in those places to hope and to love and to joy, we want to invite you forward. We want to partner with you in inviting the work of the Holy Spirit to do that transformative work in your life. So you can come forward now. And for the rest of us, maybe our response, we've all likely known the love of Jesus in our lives. And maybe our response is to pray like Thomas, my Lord and my God, right? It's to jump in the water. It's to worship and respond, because that's really the only way to respond when we see Jesus for who he is. And so let's worship and let's pray together.